Lipedema is a very specific fat on your body, how it feels, how it looks under an ultrasound, et cetera, et cetera. Just because you carry weight in your lower body or a pear shape does not automatically mean you have lipedema. But they're looking at maybe there is some influence of where your body stores it, a predisposition, and then also maybe there's another genetic marker that will then influence the fat becoming different. Hey, beautiful soul, and welcome to Dear Body, I'm Listening, the podcast for women living with chronic illness, invisible symptoms, and the quiet grief of feeling dismissed in your own body. I'm Donna Piper, and here we tell the truth about healing, the messy parts, the hopeful parts, and the parts no one prepared us for. This is a space for real talk, nervous system safe support, and learning to trust your body again, one breath at a time. Hey, beautiful soul, and welcome back to Dear Body, I'm Listening. And this is another edition of the Dear Body Book Club. I'm Donna Piper, and if this is your first book club episode, welcome. This is where I take some of the books that I read about my various symptoms or diseases, like lipedema, mast cell activation syndrome, ME/chronic fatigue syndrome, POTS, and hypermobility, EDS, hypermobility spectrum disorder, dysautonomia, books like that I've read that I think could be important if everyone knew in the community. If you're suffering from any of these diseases, think you may have them, and or a caregiver for someone that has them. So I'm not going to read you the book, but these are some of the gems I think that everyone should know, whether you want to buy the book or not. And to be quite honest, this book, even though I love it and I'm really excited that we have it now, it's called Lipedema, Principles and Practice of Diagnosis and Treatment. The editors are Stanley Rockson, MD, Leslyn Keith, OTD, and Catherine Seo, PhD. So they're all doctors, and they've all worked tirelessly in the lipedema community to really send out education, get people to understand what it is, but also they live with it themselves or they treat patients that have it. So they have a lot of practical knowledge, and they edited this book, and I haven't counted the number of contributors, but every chapter is contributed by, they have various contributors, or they take all of the research that is accumulated thus far. And this was printed back in, let me get the exact. So it was this year, 2026, but I know there was going to be a printing date in February. And then in April, I think I got mine in May or June. So it's fairly recent. But as always, there might be new studies, new things that come up within the course of these several months since a book is printed. And today we're going to look at the second section of the book that is all about genes, genetics, and see if and what research thus far says about genetic markers for lipedema. So I'm combining chapters 3, 4, and 5 because they belong together. They're a section of the book, but also because there's a lot of dense scientific reading. The third chapter really goes into genome-wide association studies, what they're all about. And then chapter 4 looks at genetic analysis of non-syndromic primary lipedema. So it's a very short chapter because there's not a lot in it. And then chapter 5 goes deeper into genes, gene signaling, connective tissue, metabolism, inflammation, hormones, lipids, epigenetics, and what researchers are beginning to find out when they actually study the lipedema tissue itself, not just surmise or look at the closeness with obesity or how the fat responds or lymphatics. They're actually looking at the tissue. So that's like the most exciting thing, I think. So stay with me, pull up a chair or get in your coziest chair with your compression and some hot tea, whatever you like. And, I've kind of looked at this as, what questions as I'm reading as a patient, even though this book is really written for practitioners, You know, is there an understanding thus far why it runs in families? Why does it predominantly affect women? Why do connective tissue differences and hypermobility keep showing up in this community? Why does the lipedema tissue hurt? Why does it bruise? Why does it behave differently from the rest of the fat on the body? And really, is lipedema fat actually biologically different tissue? These three, if you are a really scientific research paper driven, you love reading scientific papers, these three chapters are for you. I am not going to give you much of that jargon or get into it in depth. I'm just really going to look at, as a patient, kind of what do I want to know, and then what might be interesting for me to relate to my care team. And how does this maybe, because I'm looking at it through a lens of 5 diseases, not just lipedema, but I have POTS and I've had migraines ever since I was little. And that is something we could talk about maybe later. The migraine brain is supposed to be different, but, that's also connected in with the hypermobility EDS. So are they different animals? We just don't know, right? So with hypermobility, I have that. I have MCAS, and then I have ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. So I am looking at this research and stuff like how also do all those things link together, and my personally lived experience without a diagnosis for 53 years and my lived experience for the last 2 years with lived experience. So I'm just pulling out nuggets of this chapter. Feel free to buy the book. I'm going to link any research that I reference in here so you can take a look at it for yourself, and obviously link the book in the show notes. So let's get started. And let's open this book where research meets real life. Welcome to Dear Body Book Club, where we open the books that are shaping the future of chronic illness care. Together, we'll translate the research, unpack medical language, and discover what it means in real life, one page at a time. Now let's open the book where research meets real life. So if I had to take these 3 chapters, which are together packed with genetic variants, SNP sequencing, metabolism, signaling pathways, and enough acronyms to make my brain kind of melt a little, to one big idea, it would be this. Researchers are beginning to find evidence that lipedema isn't simply about how much adipose tissue someone has. They're investigating why that tissue develops where it does, why it behaves the way it does, and what biological systems may be driving it. And spoiler alert, they're not finding an answer, right? And not one little neat answer. What they are appearing to find is that there is not currently one single gene that explains lipedema. There isn't one blood test, and there isn't one genetic test where you can spit into a tube and 2 weeks later you get an email saying, hey, you have the lipedema gene plus, right? There is a picture that is emerging in these chapters, and it's much more complicated. Potentially, it involves many genes interacting with one another. Body fat distribution, sex hormones, blood vessel biology, connective tissue, inflammation, metabolism, lipid signaling, and possibly epigenetic influences. And that complexity may eventually help us explain something that those with lipedema have. I've already kind of known that, 2 women can both have lipedema and experiencing it very, very differently. One person might have enormous pain, heaviness, bruises constantly, and the other one has none of those symptoms or very mild, right? Someone might have significantly more swelling, or there might be more of your body limbs involved. They might be at different stages. The staging might have been non-existent, and then all of a sudden you're in stage 3. You might have stage 1 forever. So everyone is very different. And we've known that, but science is just backing that up.
Hey, I'm running out to drop off a stack of letters and packages. Need anything shipped while I'm gone?
Save the gas. Stamps.com lets you print postage and schedule pickups right from your desk. Sync your contacts into the address book, get detailed accounting insights, and get notified the moment your certified mail is delivered.
All from my desk?
All from your desk.
Join the 4 million businesses using Stamps.com right now with code PODCAST and get your free welcome gift. Stamps.com, code PODCAST. Taxes and fees apply.
So let's begin with chapter 3. So it's kind of like a genetic treasure hunt. It really talks about genome-wide association studies and those associated with the lipedema phenotype. So one of the first things they really establish is that family history is common in lipedema. And this chapter discusses the estimates ranging from 40% to 89% of people with lipedema reporting a positive family history. So that's a very wide range, right? 40% to 89%. So we can't say that it's all genetic. But, as we get into it, it may be because of where the lipedema actually comes from, what parent on the genetic marking side. But it does appear to be appearing in families. And what is being inherited, actually? What is the marker? Or what do they think that the patient experiences? And they're kind of looking backward, like look in your family, right? Could be your mom, sister, aunts, could be grandmother, could be great-grandmother. And you want to look on both sides because even if it comes from your mom, then you might want to look on like her dad's side of the family. Is it more? Maybe your parents both have it on both sides of the family. As we've discussed, if you listen to chapter 1, what came apparent in that chapter is that it does appear to be passed down on the paternal line. So even though men don't experience the symptoms as we do as they come out on the body types and things, it looks like that is how things are being passed along. And they also talk, they give you some interesting scientific jargon. So what the heck is a GWAS? So this chapter talks a lot about what this is. It sets it up so you understand the scientific method behind it, and it's genome-wide association study. Basically, researchers have DNA of a whole bunch of people with a particular disease and then a whole bunch of people without it, and then they compare what is the differences. Where are these markers? How are these genomes? How do they vary different from patients with not presenting a disease to with presenting? And they're just looking for patterns because they don't really know what to look for right now. So in the beginning, when you look for these genetic markers, it's really about looking for patterns, looking for people with it and without, and what is that differentiation. And a genome-wide association study doesn't look for the cause of the disease. It just looks about like, okay, what is something that they can associate with it? What is missing or what is an addition or how is this one gene might be different that keeps showing up that's different from a population without it. So it's just starting to look for a foundation, a framework. And one of the things that they're finding with these studies and looking at these patterns is that there is genetics on body fat distribution. It's not just how much adipose or fat tissue someone has, it's really where the body stores it. So they have had some studies that have already identified genetic variants associated with things like waist to hip ratio and other patterns of body fat distribution, and some genetic effects appear to differ between women and men. And that becomes relevant to lipedema because the characteristic of fat distribution is one of the defining features of the disease and how you get clinically diagnosed. And many women experience this disproportionate fat tissue around hips, buttocks, thighs, lower legs, and sometimes the arms. In later stages, usually the arms and abdomen are included. The abdomen is a whole other topic. If some surgeons, people say it is there, some don't. But for me, in my experience, I have it in my abdomen and, my body doesn't just say, oh, hey, it's the abdomen. we're diseased fat. If my body's not functioning properly, it's finding a way to function. So that's a whole other story, but that's not what's in the book. So back to the book. Okay. So researchers are asking whether some of the genes that influence body fat distribution may also contribute to someone getting lipedema potentially. And I want to emphasize this does not mean in any shape or form that being pear-shaped means you have lipedema. No, lipedema is a very specific fat on your body, how it feels, how it looks under an ultrasound, et cetera, et cetera. Just because you carry weight in your lower body or are pear-shaped does not automatically mean you have lipedema. But they're looking at maybe there is some influence of where your body stores it, a predisposition, and then also maybe there's another genetic marker that will then influence the fat becoming different. So there is a UK biobank study, and this chapter really discusses this. So what happens is that, okay, the UK biobank has health and genetic information from hundreds of thousands of people, but the lipedema specific is what they're trying to find, and that's the problem because a lot of women are historically and massively undiagnosed. So even though they have all this DNA stuff, they don't really know how many women of those women that have lipedema are actually clinically diagnosed. So that is a big problem, right? So they've created what they call a proxy lipedema phenotype. And basically they used measurements that approximated the characteristically lipedema sort of pattern. And they have identified 18 regions of a genome that were significantly associated with that lipedema-like phenotype. So again, these aren't actually women. They're not taking this really huge study with women that all have lipedema, right? They're doing their best educated research guess in what it's like. So the thing that's interesting about this is that they looked at a smaller group of women with clinically diagnosed lipedema, and 2 genetic regions showed significant association. One involved the VEGFA, and VEGFA is connected with blood vessel formation, and the other one is a GRB14-COBLL1 region, and that link has to do with fat biology and body fat distribution. Again, there's no proof, but they took the phenotype-like body type of this very large pool, and then they took a smaller type with women that actually were diagnosed. And these are 2 things that they found. And that's it. They're not anything diagnostic. It's nothing conclusive, but that is something to further explore. And then there's another UK study that Chapter 3 also discusses with 200 clinically assessed women with lipedema. And here's a couple things I found interesting. The average reported age of onset was around 16.8 years old, and then more than half, about 58%, reported a family history. Researchers also recorded some clinical characteristics, including bruising, edema, venous abnormalities, pain, dieting history, and hypermobility. So we're going to leave hypermobility for Chapter 5 because that's what it really takes off. But I just want to have you note that those things keep on coming up. 16.8 is usually around puberty or menses when they first start, maybe younger or later, but that's an average. There is a family history and hypermobile. So now let's go on to Chapter 4. So this really talks about the genetic analysis of non-syndromic primary lipedema. So basically, you have lipedema, and it's also one fact from the first chapter, which there is inheritance with sex limitation. So what all this means is that a man may potentially carry genetic susceptibility for lipedema without visibly expressing the typical disease himself and pass that susceptibility onto the next generation. So your dad's line, or if your dad, his family line, etc., matters in all of this. So that could be, and I talked about it a little bit just prior, but like if you look at your parents and you're like, oh, I don't look like my mom, I don't look like my grandparents, but maybe you didn't know your dad or your dad. Like in my case, my dad was adopted. So I didn't know what his family looked like genetically on his side. So, and my dad didn't have obviously any of this weight. So for me, I would have been someone that I don't have a family history when actually I probably do, right? If I look at my dad's side, that's probably how I got it. And my dad, my grandfather's sisters, they didn't seem to have it, but I didn't really know that many people on his side. So I don't know. And my grandmother's family didn't have it on my mom's side. So we'll see. So most likely it would come from my dad. And they're also looking at a particular mutation in this chapter called AKR1C1. And this gene is interesting because it involves the metabolism of a steroid hormone, including progesterone. So basically, how your steroid hormones get metabolized is this AKR1C1. However, let's not say that progesterone or more or whatever is the cause, because we have no idea. It just means that there is some sort of involvement. So there's some genetics, there's some hormones, fat cell biology, and pain. But we're not making the leap because it's also hasn't been shown to explain every case of lipedema. But it gives the researchers some incredibly valuable information that a biological pathway is really worth investigating. And this matters because women have reported lipedema onset or worsening around major hormonal transitions for generations. So there's puberty, pregnancy, menopause, perimenopause, different fertility stuff. Like everyone is a little bit different. And they can now look to see if it's this pathway that metabolizes hormones and why those stages matter and what it does. So again, not any real information other than more information to be looked at later. And chapter 4 also ends with looking at all the genetic versions of lipedema. So the important thing from that is that some of these different genes are connected to fat cell differentiation. Some influence glucose metabolism, some influence hormone-sensitive lipids, some are connected with metabolic pathways, others are associated with connective tissue or overlapping conditions. And it just reinforces the idea that lipedema is likely polygenic or genetically heterogeneous. So basically, they don't know, but it's usually lipedema, and those of you living with it or caring for someone with it, it's complicated. And there may not be just right now, there's not just one thing that is this is why you have it and this is what's causing it. We're still looking for it. But maybe in the future, they can say, other than saying you have lipedema, they can say, okay, you have a lipedema and it's this type of lipedema, or what kind of lipedema biology you have is XYZ. So that's where we're headed likely. Also, chapter 4 is very optimistic about next generation genetic sequencing and the possibility of improving the diagnosis. It even discusses early work with microRNAs that might someday serve as biomarkers. But we get into chapter 5, and then it explicitly says one major remaining challenge in lipedema is the absence of a reliable, specific, reproducible diagnostic marker, whether genetic or biochemical. So right now, you cannot take a validated genetic test that will definitely tell you whether you have lipedema or not. It's still a clinical diagnosis. That's why awareness matters. That's why this book matters. That's why you telling people and educating providers and people in your life about lipedema if you have it. And that's why all of this talking about it matters. So now let's get to chapter 5. So talks about what is actually different about lipedema tissue. And this is where it gets, I think, more interesting, right? Chapter 5 is called Integrating Genes and the Gene Signaling Networks Implicated in the Patients with Lipedema, What We Know and Where We're Headed. And this chapter moves beyond which genes might predispose someone to lipedema and start asking what is actually happening inside the lipedema tissue. And I think it's one of the most important shifts in the entire book because for decades, the conversation around bodies like ours has been incredibly superficial. They look at you and you're like, oh, you're fat. You have too much fat. Lose weight, move more, eat less, blah, blah, blah. End of discussion. Now they are looking at the actual tissue at a molecular level, and this simple story is very quickly falling apart. And there isn't one magic bullet gene, which this chapter reinforces, but they do start with showing us in chapter 5 that one research group designed as a next-generation sequencing panel containing 305 genes that might potentially have relevance to lipedema or overlapping conditions. They studied 162 Italian and American patients with lipedema. Potentially damaging genetic variants were found only in a subset of those patients. Another family study looked at 31 individuals from 9 lipedema families and found hundreds of candidate genetic variants. So what does all that mean and why is that important? There is no single gene that was mutated in every family. So researchers themselves begin moving away the idea that it's a gene that gets mutated or there's one gene that is causing it. And it makes more sense to think about it in clusters of genetic vulnerabilities or biological pathways. So again, they're just reinforcing the idea that it's complicated, but one particular category showed up that is especially interesting to me, and hopefully many to you, is connective tissue. So, what is lipedema and connective tissue? In chapter 5, the family studied that I just discussed, researchers found an overrepresentation of genetic variants involving the extracellular matrix, or ECM. So the extracellular matrix is basically part of the scaffolding that surrounds and supports our cells. It's involved with collagen, elastin, microfibrils, the architecture and communication of tissues. And one of the genes that caught researchers' attention was something called TNXB. So TNXB encodes a protein called tensin X. Variants affecting the T-X have been associated with a form of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I know some of you just perked up. I know I did because hypermobility and lipedema show up together in a lot of conversations happening inside this community. I know that I have HEDS, and it's a big part of what I had to learn and unlearn about moving my body, not just lipedema. So I was really excited that this chapter even mentioned it, but the chapter does not say we have proven that Ehlers-Danlos causes lipedema, or that's why you have lipedema is because it's a part of it. So right now, EDS, amazing, amazing community. They have so much research. They're just changing their hypermobility guidelines in December and next year that they're rolling out, that they're all about the dysautonomia community, and that's a part of this. But I know that I'm connected with lipedema with that. I know how it's involved, but the research in that community does not have lipedema as a subset of it yet. So maybe in the future. This chapter does not say that. Those are my own words. And because they're just finding this association in this relationship, but they don't know. It's like, a brand new relationship. It's kind of uncertain. Where's it going to go? Are we going to merge together? Are we going to stay apart, right? But the author does point out that findings involving TNXB and other extracellular matrix genes may provide an early biological clue connecting two things clinicians and patients have already noticed appearing together. Hypermobility was one of the clinical characteristics recorded in the UK lipedema cohort. So that was back from chapter 3, and sort of bringing it back to chapter 5. And the research question is getting better. Maybe bruising, tissue laxity, hypermobility, vascular differences, fascia, and adipose abnormalities aren't always completely separate and different medical side quest, right? And I've been talking about in this my podcast because connective tissue is everywhere. So my hypothesis for my body, for what I do, is that my connective tissue issues have led to my brain being a little different, my POTS, how my body makes my veins, how they repair all the tissues. So your body is all made up of connective tissue and they all relate. So for me, I think my basis is the hypermobility and everything kind of stemmed from there with a predisposition for lipedema that was passed down from my father. So that's what I think. So let's see what the rest of chapter 5 says. So now we're going to look inside the fat. And this is kind of a really cool part because it introduces us to what's called MOICS technology. So MOICS sounds like a Marvel villain or maybe a supplement company that's about to change your life for, $95 magnesium. But really, it is a way of looking at different layers of biology. So what happens is they examine a gene expression and what gene is active, which is quieter, what's being turned up, what's being turned down. And that's transcript optics that does that. So metabolomics looks at the small molecules involved in metabolism, what's happened with energy production, what metabolic pathways appear differently. And lipidomics looks specifically at lipids or fats and fat-related molecules inside the tissues. And when the researchers combine all of those layers, they get something much closer to an aerial view of what the tissue is actually doing. And when they applied these approaches to lipedema tissue, they found out a lot. One multi-omics analysis described in Chapter 5 identified more than 4,400 significant differences in gene expression in lipedema tissue. Researchers also found more than 900 changes in lipid compositions and more than 600 altered metabolites. Okay, let's pause a little bit there. More than 4,400 gene expression differences, more than 900 lipid changes, and then more than 600 altered metabolites. So, what does that even mean? And researchers say this does not mean they understand every one of those differences, right? They don't. They're just pointing them out. But some prove that it's clinically important. Others turn out to be, they may be just consequences rather than causes. And this is, something I want to really emphasize. Researchers are finding measurable biological differences in lipedema tissue. So I think that's the most important part. It's not about the fat cell getting bigger and then we're going to shrink it through diet and exercises, blah, 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 like a regular fat cell. But actually, the tissue is complicated and there's different signaling happening inside the tissue, and it's telling your body a different story. So inflammation is also part of the research. That also in Chapter 5, they discuss differences involving inflammatory pathways. So studies have reported increased expression of inflammatory cytokines, including IL-1 beta and IL-6 and TNF alpha. These inflammatory signals may influence fat cell enlargement and vascular permeability, potentially contributed to fluid accumulation and other features seen in lipedema. Again, nuance matters. This does not mean to say inflammation causes lipedema, but we all know that we have inflammation, and inflammation does not help, and we are inflamed. So when your body's inflamed, what does it do? It swells, it sends stuff to heal, right? So, that's why just eating an anti-inflammatory diet is just going to cure lipedema. Hey, maybe it will help you significantly with the swelling, and swelling is something that is super annoying for those of us that have to wear compression all the time and deal with swelling. That is a component, but that doesn't mean by just solving inflammation, it's going to change your life dramatically and it's never going to affect you again. Hopefully you're one of those people that it does, but in a good majority of cases, that has not been the actual boots on the ground like effect that we had hoped. What it does tell us is that inflammatory signaling appears to be a part of the tissue environment researchers are studying. The same goes for the genes involved in formation and development of fat cells. Researchers are finding altered expression and pathways involved in this fat cell proliferation and differentiation. So the question becomes, why are these cells developing and behaving this way? Not why is this woman eating too much and not exercising enough, right? That's out. Metabolism may be different too. Researchers have documented alterations in pathways related to glucose and lipid metabolism. And they are beginning to ask whether lipedema fat handles energy signaling and lipid storage differently from typical fat tissue. We cannot take these findings and turn them into a perfect diet or a targeted medication, but biology matters because, again, maybe fat isn't simply fat. Maybe adipose tissue or fat tissue in different diseases behaves differently and leads us beautifully into one of my favorite concepts of the whole chapter, the fat atlas. For years, fat tissue was basically treated like a passive storage closet. Calories come in, extra energy gets shoved into fat. Fat sits there, the end of science lesson. But fat tissue is much more complex than that. Chapter 5 talks about the emerging data of fat atlas. We know there are different types of fat tissue: white fat, brown fat, beige fat. Different anatomical fat deposits contain different cellular populations and can behave differently. And researchers studying lipedema are now asking the question that seems so obvious once you hear it. Is fat from one region of the body biologically different than another fat region? Could the stem cells in thigh tissue behave different from cells in abdominal adipose or fat tissue? Could regional biology help explain why lipedema affects certain areas so dramatically while sparing others? Researchers don't have those answers yet, but I love this question because it completely changes the conversation. For decades, women asked, why can't I lose my fat on my legs? And the better scientific question is, why is the tissue on my legs behaving differently? And, I hope you feel a difference between those two questions because they are two very different. One is accusation, the other one is an investigation. And, one assumes that it's a behavior problem or lifestyle problem, and the other looks at okay, biologically, this is something going on. You might need something else, which I've been saying for, I don't know, since I found out that I had this a couple years, but like a year and a little over a year since I've had this podcast. Now, we still need to talk about hormones because they're still involved in this room. And we go back to sex hormones. Lipedema predominantly affects women. And its onset or worsening is repeatedly associated with clinically hormonal significant stages like puberty, pregnancy, fertility treatments, menopause, perimenopause. Researchers are particularly interested in estrogen signaling and how estrogen may affect adipose tissue distribution and fatty acid metabolism. And I want to be really very clear here because social media loves making one scientific sentence and turning into estrogen is the root cause of your lipedema. Buy my detox. However, no. Same with inflammation, all these things. Yes, we live it. We know there's association, but doctors still don't know why. So we don't really know in every body type, how is it going to help or why, right? And these chapters, I want to be clear about that. They do not say that estrogen causes lipedema. They say that there's an interaction between genetics, hormones, adipose biology, so fat, and environmental influences. And they all say it deserves deeper investigation. When we combine that with the AKR1C1 research from Chapter 4 involving progesterone metabolism, the hormone question gets more interesting. We're not at an answer. We're just at better questions, right? And sometimes this is how science moves forward, is just better questions. So epigenetics, and please don't turn this into self-blames because that's not what epigenetics is. So I forget the creator of epigenetics, but Bruce Lipton. Amazing. So read that book. It's also very dense, but if you want to learn about epigenetics, it's not about you did something. It's just sometimes your genes signaling will turn on different things that are dormant. Okay. So chapter 5 says, so that was my explanation, but their version is very simple. Epigenetic refers to changes in how genes are expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence. So think of your DNA as a book. I like to think of it as like a sheet of music, right? And how it gets played by different people may change the tune, may change how you hear it. You can have the same song and the same notes, but someone plays them differently or they emphasize something more and then that gets played out. And that's really what it is. So, this chapter raises the possibility that environmental factors, diet, hormonal shifts, and even trauma, which I think is significant, may affect epigenetic regulation relevant to lipedema. Researchers are also studying chromatin, which is a part of how DNA is packaged and made available for gene expression. Early work described the chapter suggests difference in regulation within the lipedema tissue. So this is fascinating and is also exactly the kind of science we need to handle responsibility. Because if epigenetics is not a new way to blame yourself, right? If the future research shows environmental or epigenetic factors and how they influence lipedema expression, that is exciting, but that does not mean that you cause the disease to come out when you are stressed, that you ate wrong, that you failed to regulate your nervous system. No, susceptibility, so predisposition, hormones, biology, environment, and gene expression can interact in extraordinary, complicated ways. And this is a very complicated disease, and that is part of it. And the purpose is understanding that interaction to create better treatments, not better ways to blame yourself. So, why is this research taking so long? Another part of chapter 5 that I think patients deserve to understand is studying lipedema tissue is technically difficult. Where are researchers going to get the tissues? Often from liposuction, but liposuction mechanically disrupts tissue. So, tissue may experience trauma, low oxygen, natural architecture has been altered that can affect what the researchers have to measure. So, hey, well, let's take a biopsy, but a superficial biopsy may not reach the deeper adipose layers research actually want to study. Ideally, we'd want the intact tissue sample from early stage lipedema, except we're not removing chunks of perfectly intact adipose tissue from women with early stages because researchers would like a pristine sample, right? So many samples come from later disease, and researchers have to ask, are there differences when we're seeing part of the original disease to the later disease progression? So does it change? What does it look like? And what are we really looking at? And that's the scientific problem. And I appreciate the book explaining this because patients hear more research is needed over and over, but sometimes it sounds like, elevator music or something like that. But there are legitimate technical reasons why good lipedema research is hard. Scientists are trying to study a complicated living tissue ecosystem while also dealing with an underdiagnosed disease, small patient cohorts, inconsistent diagnosis definitions, and imperfect tissue samples. So it's all difficult science. And at least, I want people to hear that because yes. Is it under-researched, underfunded, under-talked about? Absolutely. Is it a real disease that needs more attention? Absolutely. But is it difficult maybe to do some of these experiments in science to really look at the stuff? That's also an absolutely.
It's time for Donna's Sticky Notes, the highlights I don't want you to miss. If you only remembered a few ideas from today's episode, these would be the ones I'd leave on a sticky note.
Okay, so these are like 3 little quick sticky notes I want you to remember if you always want to go to this section, then that's there. It's like your Cliff Notes version, right? Sticky note number 1, don't forget dad's side of the family. I think that is so when looking to see if it's inherited or not, if you have access to paternal lines, photos, family members, and it doesn't seem to be on your maternal line, look to your father's line. Maybe it's not, maybe you can't find it like me, but see if you can. The next sticky note number 2. There probably isn't one lipedema gene. And that's kind of what I gathered from the whole thing is that, hey, that would be exciting if it is. And maybe in the future there might. But as it stands now, it's more about how that gene and your predisposition to it actually interacts with many, many factors. And it's still unclear how they interact, what makes the stages grow significantly when you're younger or when you're older or not at all. So you can have lipedema and you don't have to be stage 3, but you had it in stage 1, we all did, and sometimes it doesn't evolve into that. So that is still something that we're looking at, right? But what we are discovering, which we kind of already knew, but the book states again, it involves hormones, fat biology, connective tissue, vascular pathways, metabolism, lymphatic function, inflammation, and probably some things we even haven't discovered yet. Then the last sticky note is lipedema tissue appears to be biologically different tissue. So this is, I think, the most important sticky note is that researchers are finding differences in gene expression, lipids, metabolites, inflammatory signaling, fat cell development, blood vessel pathways, extracellular matrix, connective tissue related genes. And maybe instead of asking, like, why do I have so much fat in these certain areas? The better question that you and your provider could be asking is what is happening inside the tissues to make this fat behave differently, and having your doctors for the moment refer you to conservative care options to support what is going on in your body, not just, I don't know, it's probably your age, diet more, move more, etc.
And now it's time for the Dear Body letter. One letter, one reflection, one conversation with your body that's been speaking to you all along.
Dear body, maybe this really does run in my family. Maybe the clues were there long before anyone knew what it meant or what to call it. In my grandma's legs, in my mom's bruises, in an aunt who stopped wearing skirts, in a woman on my dad's side of the family whose body looked strangely familiar to mine. Maybe generations of women stood in dressing rooms pulling fabric over their thighs that never seemed to match the rest of them. Maybe they dieted, exercised, lost weight, regained weight, lost it again, and wondered why certain parts of their bodies barely changed. Maybe they lived with pain they never called pain, heaviness they simply learned to tolerate, bruises they stopped noticing, and bodies they were taught were evidence of something that they were doing wrong. Maybe nobody failed. Maybe nobody knew. And now researchers are looking deeper, not only at what you look like from the outside, at genes, hormones, connective tissue, inflammatory signals, blood vessels, fat development cells, metabolism, lipids. The tiny biological conversations happening inside tissue that no one could see. Dear body, I wish we had known sooner. I wish the women before us had been given language instead of blame. But there's something I'm learning from these chapters. I don't have to wait for science to solve every mystery before I stop blaming you. Your pain was real before researchers measured it. Your heaviness was real before someone sequenced a gene. Your bruising was real before the first genome-wide association study. Your body was telling the truth before medicine knew how to translate it. And maybe that's the piece I want to pass forward. not another generation of women being told to hate their bodies until science catches up, but another generation being told, pay attention, be curious, ask questions, look at family history, and don't confuse not yet understood with not real. Dear body, I'm listening. Love me. This is shared education and lived experience, not medical advice, and is not meant to be. Check in with your body, check in with your clinician, and find out what fits your life. And that's it for chapters 3, 4, and 5 for our Dear Body book club. There are probably some of the most technical chapters I've covered so far, but underneath all of the genetic language and the things that I cannot pronounce, I think they contain one of the most validating messages in the book. Science is looking deeper than body size. Researchers are asking why lipedema runs in families, why it predominantly affects women, why hormones seem to matter, why connective tissue findings keep appearing, why lipedema adipose tissue shows differences in metabolism, inflammatory signaling, lipids, and gene expression, and whether what we currently call lipedema can eventually turn out to contain several different biological subtypes. We don't have all the answers. We don't have a definite lipedema genetic test. We should not take emergent science and turn it into certainty before the research gets there. But something important is happening. The question is changing from why does my body look this way to what is the biology going on inside of my body to produce this disease? And that's progress. If you have lipedema, here's a little book club homework, not medical homework, just curiosity homework. Look at your family tree, and not only your mother, your father's side too. And you don't need to diagnose grandma or any of your family, but just notice. Because sometimes that one generation called, oh, that's just how we're built, is the next generation's finally the ability to understand why. And if this episode made you think of your mom, sister, aunt, or daughter, or someone on your dad's side of the family, please send it to them. And if you're reading the book along with me, and we're working through lipedema principles in the practice of diagnosis and treatment, I'll keep sending out these episodes that points out research that I think matters to both of us actually living with this disease. And remember, there's nothing wrong with you. You've just been living in a body that's been misunderstood. Keep listening to yourself, keep trusting yourself, and keep coming home to yourself. Thank you again for listening. All the links will be below, and see you next time. Thanks for listening to Dear Body, I'm Listening. If this episode helped you feel a little more seen, a little more steady, or a little less alone in what your body has been carrying, share it with someone who might need that too. And remember, there's nothing wrong with you. You've just been living in a body that hasn't been understood. Until next time, keep listening gently.